Top 5 Most Horrifying Things Discovered in the Earth. 1. Ricky Medji did not have a good day, mate. We often hear stories of the animals in Australia that want us dead. For Ricky Medji, however, no Australian critter was worse than Australia itself. As detailed in The National, in January 2006 Medji was driving through Australia's Northern Territory. 3 men waved him down, claiming they had no gas. In fact, they had no scruples, being robbers who slipped a drug into Medji's drink, robbed him of virtually everything while he was passed out, and threw him in a shallow grave to die. Once Medji awoke, he was alone, had no working phone, no water, no food, no shoes, and no hope. After 2 days, he was forced to start drinking his own urine, and didn't eat anything until the 5th day. He eventually found a dam with water and such culinary delights as raw frogs, lizards, and leeches. Later, after several rounds of heat exhaustion and dehydration, he found a better dam with more water. He stayed there for almost 2 months, but man cannot live on tiny insects alone, and Medji began to waste away. Everything from getting water to simply waking up and walking around took massive effort. Finally, after 71 days, Medji was rescued by nearby station hands, who just happened to be surveying the area. By that time, he had dropped from 230 pounds to a skeletal 99 pounds, making his survival nothing short of a miracle. 2. Joe Simpson fell thousands of feet and was mostly fine. In 1985, Joe Simpson and his friend Simon Yates were climbing the Sayula Grande peak of the Peruvian Andes. Despite it being 21,000 feet high they made it, but once the descent began, nature decided to play. A blinding snowstorm hit, and Simpson destroyed his leg. If you've never tried to scale a mountain with a broken leg, don't. Yates attempted to rescue Simpson by laying him on a makeshift stretcher tied to a rope and gradually lowering him until the rope reached its limit. That worked until, as Simpson told people, he was accidentally lowered over a super deep crevasse. Gravity started pulling Yates toward the cliff, and he had to cut the rope to avoid careening to the ground below. This, however, sent Simpson careening to the ground below, and Yates eventually returned to the campsite overcome with grief and guilt. But Yates had unknowingly saved his friend's life. Simpson crashed through soft snow, breaking his fall enough to keep him both alive and conscious. He then crawled 6 miles back to camp. It took him about 60 hours to do so, relieving Yates of the feeling that he had just brutally murdered his friend. Along with the broken leg, Simpson lost about 42 pounds on the mountain. But he came out living, plus he got to write a book and make a movie about his ordeal, which are all better alternatives to death. 3. Jan Balsrud nearly froze to death, but it was better than Nazis. Jan Balsrud was a Norwegian who opposed the Nazis, and since he did so in an actual, Nazi-killing manner, his country's occupiers had a severe issue with him. As told by the Scotsman, after killing a couple Germans in a firefight, Balsrud started running in the direction of Sweden, a neutral country where the Nazis couldn't get him. He walked for almost a week non-stop, and considering one of the Nazis shot him in the foot, that's pretty impressive. But then, an avalanche sent him plummeting 300 feet, catapulting his story from impressive to legendary. He woke up concussed but kept stumbling in what he hoped was the direction of Sweden. He walked alone in the deep, blowing snow, for 2 months. Finally, he stumbled upon the village of Fleruflitten, where the local Nazi resistance group nursed him back to health. They then brought him to some Lapps tribesmen in the Revdal mountain, who put him on a sled and whisked him into Sweden. Balsrud had survived, though he weighed about 80 pounds when he arrived in Fleruflitten. Plus, he was so frostbitten he lost 9 toes, which he had to amputate himself. But he lived, and went on to be knighted by the Queen of England. Time took him away in 1988, at age 70, long after both Nazis and the elements failed to do so. 4. 2 men had the ultimate bad day in the mountains. Teenage buddies Tommy Hendricks and Matthew Smith were hiking in November 2016 when everything went wrong at the worst possible time. As they told Backpacker, they were halfway up the 1,200-foot cross couloir when a snowstorm arrived a day earlier than expected. They would have loved to climb back down, but the deep snow, blinding storm, and incoming darkness made it impossible. They couldn't climb down once at the peak either, since it was pitch black and they couldn't see any paths. With 50 miles per hour winds and temperatures reaching -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the pair resorted to rubbing their bare feet in each other's armpits to keep frostbite at bay. They somehow survived the night, beginning their descent the next morning. Problem is, they went the wrong way, and had no cell reception to boot. They were also without food and were getting increasingly soaked with cold water by the step. Their compasses didn't work either, thanks to the iron in the nearby rocks interfering with the compass magnets. When their waterlogged lighters failed to start a fire, that's when Matt uttered what nobody wants to say or hear, "Tommy, we could die out here." They were succumbing to hypothermia when a chopper arrived, and then flew away. The boys finally gave up and tearfully accepted death. Luckily, the chopper returned an hour later and picked them up. Maybe the chopper pilot could have dropped them a note explaining that the chopper needed to refuel. 5. Marcus Mazzaferri battled Yosemite without his glasses. In May 2017, Marcus Mazzaferri was fording a raging river at Yosemite National Park when the water began to run too deep and he slipped on a rock. He was pulled under and lost both his gear and glasses to the rapids, but he made it to shore safely. He knew he was in trouble but told himself, according to his storied backpacker, "I can do this. I'm not going to die out here. I'm not that into the wild kid. No one's going to write a book about me because I'm going to make it." Mazzaferri attempted to follow his footprints back to a shelter without glasses. That was all he could see, but darkness and the cold forced him to hunker down for the night. Knowing hypothermia could kill him if he slept, Mazzaferri would rest for 20 minutes, get up and exercise to keep from going numb, then rest another 20 minutes. In the morning, he set off on more hiking, but eventually lost track of his own footprints. Seeing no other options, or anything else, really, he started following deer tracks, which miraculously led him back to his own prints. Eventually though, he ran out of tracks again and couldn't tell which direction to go. Luckily, he heard a plow crew across a freezing river. Despite being dangerously cold already, Mazzaferri followed the sound, swimming across the river to join his new best friends.